Hey guys, tonight we're easing into something slow, long, and quietly fascinating. So go ahead and settle in. Let the room get still. Let your thoughts wander a little. And as always, we're not rushing anywhere. We're just drifting backward in time, not to battles or explosions or shocking twists. No, we're going somewhere much calmer. We're going to the ancient world, and we're going to talk about hair. Because oddly enough, this is where power, identity, rebellion, devotion, and yes, even altered states of being quietly lived. Not through potions or smoke clouds, but through ritual, through appearance, through the slow, deliberate way people shape themselves. And of course, because humans are humans, they took it way too seriously. In the ancient world, hair was never just hair, it was a public statement. You didn't wake up one day and just feel like trying something new. That kind of freedom simply didn't exist. Every strand was watched, judged, and interpreted. If you were important, your hair mattered. If you weren't important, your hair still mattered, just in more depressing ways. And if you were somewhere in between, congratulations, you were still stuck following rules you didn't make. Let's begin somewhere familiar with Rome, because Rome always believed it was the center of everything. And naturally, Roman hair reflected that confidence or arrogance, depending on your mood. For Roman men, short hair was the mark of civilization. Long, wild hair was for outsiders, barbarian types, people who didn't know how to behave themselves. So Roman citizens cropped their hair neat and practical. It suggested discipline. It suggested loyalty. It suggested that you weren't going to suddenly abandon society and run screaming into the woods. And soldiers took this even further. Practical cuts, no flair, no personality, because the army didn't want thinkers. It wanted bodies that moved in the same direction at the same time. But of course, not everyone wanted to play along. Some Romans deliberately grew their hair long, adopted foreign styles, not because it looked good, but because it annoyed the right people. And nothing says quiet rebellion like looking slightly wrong in public. Gladiators leaned into this. They exaggerated their hair, they made it dramatic, they turned themselves into walking spectacles, part athlete, part celebrity, part threat. Their hair wasn't about Roman virtue, it was about presence, and that made the elite deeply uncomfortable, which honestly just added to the appeal. Meanwhile, enslaved people were often denied hair entirely, forced to keep it short or plain, not because it was practical, but because it stripped away identity. Hair was expression, and expression was dangerous. So it was taken. And just like that, something as simple as a hairstyle became a marker of power. Who could decorate themselves and who could not? Now let's drift east gently over mountains and seas until we arrive in ancient Japan. Here, hair wasn't loud, it was controlled, precise, and absolutely loaded with meaning. Nowhere was this clearer than with the samurai top knot, the charmage. This wasn't fashion, this was a contract. At first, it was practical. A shaved crown helped helmets sit properly in battle. But over time, especially as peace settled in during the Edo period, practicality faded. What remained was symbolism. The top knot became identity. To wear it meant you belonged. To lose it meant everything was over. Cutting off a samurai's top knot wasn't just a haircut, it was social death. Disgraced warriors were ordered to remove it themselves. In some cases, the cutting came before ritual suicide, not as a separate punishment, but as part of the same process. You weren't just dying, you were being erased. And for a culture that valued honor above almost everything, this was devastating. Women's hair in Japan told different stories, but no less intense ones. In the Heian period, noble women grew their hair extraordinarily long, sometimes longer than their own bodies. It flowed straight down their backs in a style that required immense patience, care, and wealth. This wasn't casual beauty, this was controlled elegance. You couldn't maintain hair like that unless you had servants, time, money, and no real responsibilities beyond existing beautifully. Later, during the Edo period, hairstyles became sculptural, coiled buns, adorned with pins, combs, ornaments, every detail coded, marital status, age, profession, courtesans, and geisha, used increasingly elaborate styles, not just to attract attention, but to signal training and experience. Even rebellion showed up here. When laws restricted hairstyles by class, artists and ronin bent the rules, not loudly, just enough to be noticed. Now let's float south and west into Africa, where hair was an entire language. Long before outside interference, African hair traditions carried identity, spirituality, and survival. From Nubia to West Africa, hairstyles communicated age, clan, status, and belief. Nubian queens wore complex braided wigs that rivaled Egyptian royalty. Not subtle statements, power statements. Over in what is now Nigeria, the Yoruba and Igbo treated hair as art. Patterns weren't random, they were planned. Some reserved for brides, some for warriors, some for spiritual initiates. Hairdressers weren't just stylists, they were trusted figures. To touch someone's hair was to touch their essence. Among the Himba people, red ochre mixed with butterfat coated elaborate braids. This protected hair from the climate, yes, but more importantly, it marked life stages. Puberty, marriage, motherhood. Hair grew with you, changed with you, shaped by time. And during the transatlantic slave trade, this language of hair became resistance. Cornrows became maps. Patterns preserved memory. Seeds hidden in braids carried survival forward. Even when identity was stripped away, hair held on, quietly, stubbornly. Now we drift north again, into ancient Greece, where everything was supposedly about reason and beauty. And of course, appearances mattered immensely. Early Greek men wore long hair. Heroes like Achilles were described with flowing locks. This was strength, vitality, divine favor. But by the classical era, moderation became fashionable. Shorter hair became the ideal. The beard stayed. Philosophers wore it proudly. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all bearded, because apparently wisdom lived somewhere in there. The beard suggested maturity. The controlled haircut suggested reason. Too much hair implied chaos, and chaos was deeply suspicious. Slaves and foreigners were often forced to shave their heads. Having hair, the right kind of hair, became a privilege. Women's hair was tied to virtue. Respectable women wore it up and covered. Loose hair was reserved for mourning or ecstatic religious rites. Girls wore their hair down until puberty. Then a braid was cut and dedicated to Artemis. This wasn't just symbolic. It was a quiet farewell to childhood. Greek gods had hairstyles too. Athena's controlled helmeted look, Aphrodite's flowing curls. Mortals mimicked them, borrowing divine traits strand by strand. Now into ancient China, where hair was inseparable from morality. Confucianism taught that the body, including hair, was a gift from one's parents. Cutting it without reason was disrespect. This belief shaped centuries of practice. Men wore long hair tied into top knots. Scholars paired this with robes and caps. Loose hair suggested madness, mourning, or rebellion, and rebellion was never taken lightly. Women's hairstyle shifted with age and status. Girls wore youthful styles. Married women adopted mature arrangements. Court ladies in the Tang dynasty took things to theatrical extremes, towering structures adorned with phoenix pins, flowers, silk. Hair was political too. When the Qing dynasty enforced the Q hairstyle, many resisted. Some chose death over submission. To them, hair was identity, and identity was worth everything. Monks shaved their heads entirely, rejecting the world, embracing impermanence, and in doing so, made yet another powerful statement without saying a word. Finally, we drift into ancient India, where hair was sacred. Sadhus let their hair grow wild into matted dreadlocks, symbols of spiritual power, detachment from society, from vanity, from everything else. They emulated Shiva, whose own hair held back rivers. On the other side, pilgrims shaved their heads entirely, offering hair as surrender. Children's first haircuts cleansed bad karma. Mourning rituals required shaving. Humility was visible. Caste and marital status shaped hairstyles. The shikha tuft marked upper caste men. Women bound their hair differently once married. Ornamentation varied. Flowers, gold, combs. Hair was beauty, discipline, honor, and yes, sensuality. Ancient texts described it lovingly. Temple sculptures froze it in stone. And everywhere, quietly, hair became resistance. Jewish men under Roman rule refused Roman grooming. Gauls spiked their lime-washed hair into terrifying crests. Persian kings wore long curls and beards, declaring themselves unmistakably not Roman. Enslaved people preserved memory through braids. Women rejected trends to align with philosophy or faith. And when emperors fell, hairstyles fell with them. Hair was never passive. It was chosen, forced, protected, punished, and through it all, the ancient world whispered the same truth again and again. When voices were limited, when actions were dangerous, identity found a way to exist quietly, right there on the head. And that's where we stay. For now, right here, in this slow, unfolding world, where history doesn't shout, it just keeps growing. And so we stay there, letting it keep growing, because in the ancient world, nothing ever really stopped. It just shifted shape a little, like hair itself, always changing, but never gone. Now let's drift further, not jumping forward in time, not breaking the rhythm, just sliding sideways into other corners of the same old world where people were still quietly negotiating who they were allowed to be through what grew from their heads. In the Celtic lands, stretching across parts of Gaul and the British Isles, hair was loud on purpose. Celtic warriors washed their hair with lime, stiffening it into pale, spiked shapes that made their heads look larger, more intimidating, almost unreal. This wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. It was psychological warfare before the sword ever came out. Roman writers loved to describe this with a mix of fascination and horror, because of course they did. To them, it was proof of barbarism. But to the Celts, it was identity, strength, fearlessness, and maybe just a little bit of enjoying how uncomfortable it made everyone else. Bards and nobles wore their hair long and carefully groomed, often with mustaches that were equally dramatic. Cutting a man's hair without consent was an insult that could start blood feuds because you weren't just touching his appearance, you were touching his honor. And honor, once touched, demanded a response. Among Celtic women, hair carried its own quiet authority. Long hair symbolized freedom and fertility. Some laws even specified penalties for damaging a woman's hair, placing it alongside physical injury. This tells us everything we need to know about how deeply hair was tied to personhood. Not decoration, not accessory, but self. And when Christianity slowly crept into these regions, one of the first visible changes was hair. Monastic tonsures appeared, strange circular shavings that marked devotion and submission. The old styles didn't vanish overnight. They faded, sometimes blended, sometimes resisted. Hair became a quiet battlefield between old gods and new beliefs. Slide east again, and we arrive in Persia, where the Achaemenid kings understood the power of looking divine almost as much as they understood the power of armies. Persian reliefs show rulers with meticulously curled beards and carefully arranged hair. This wasn't vanity, this was cosmic order. The king's appearance reflected the harmony of the empire. Every curl deliberate, every strand controlled. To appear disordered was to suggest weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. For Persian nobles, grooming was a sign of refinement, not excess. The beard especially became a symbol of wisdom and authority. To cut it short could signal mourning or disgrace or submission, and enemies knew this. When Persians were humiliated by conquerors, their beards were targeted, not because hair grows back, but because meaning doesn't fade so easily. Persian women, though less documented, also wore elaborate hairstyles, often hidden beneath veils or crowns. The hair itself was private, powerful in its concealment, and priests treated hair with ritual seriousness. Fire temples demanded purity, no stray hairs, no disorder. Even here, strands mattered. Now let's drift into the ancient Near East, into Mesopotamia, where cities rose between rivers and gods watched everything. Here, hair was written into law, literally. The Code of Hammurabi included punishments involving hair, for cutting off someone's hair without cause, for shaving slaves as punishment, for marking criminals. Hair was legal identity. Barbers weren't just groomers, they were professionals trusted with social order. Beards were styled by rank. Free men wore full beards. Slaves wore trimmed ones. Priests shaved entirely before entering temples, removing all impurity before approaching the divine. And gods themselves were imagined with perfect hair and beards carved endlessly into stone. As above, so below. Assyrian kings took this obsession further. Reliefs show beards braided into impossible precision, curled, stacked, layered. This wasn't realism. This was idealization. The king didn't just rule, he embodied control. And nothing says control like a beard that looks like it took an entire team in several hours. But again, the meaning mattered more than the effort. A perfect beard meant a perfect king, at least visually, and visuals were everything. Now slide gently south into Egypt, where hair became something you could remove entirely and still obsess over. Egyptians shaved their heads regularly, not because they disliked hair, but because of hygiene, spiritual cleanliness, and climate. But shaving didn't mean absence. It meant substitution. Wigs became essential. Wigs of human hair, wigs of plant fibers, wigs styled elaborately, perfumed, braided, adorned. Every class wore them just differently. The elite wore the finest. The poor wore simpler versions. But everyone participated. Natural hair was hidden. Private, public hair was crafted. This separation mattered. Priests shaved their entire bodies before rituals, every hair removed. nothing left that could trap impurity. Pharaohs wore false beards, even women pharaohs, because the beard was a symbol of divine kingship, not masculinity. The uraeus cobra rose from carefully arranged hairpieces. Crowns sat atop shaved heads. The real body beneath was irrelevant. What mattered was the image, and Egyptian art preserved this perfectly, unchanging, serene, hair frozen in idealized time. Children in Egypt wore the sidelock of youth, a single braid on an otherwise shaved head. This marked them as children under protection. When it was cut, childhood ended quietly, not with ceremony, but with scissors. And once again, hair marked transition. Now flowed eastward again into the ancient Levant, where hair was tied tightly to covenant and devotion. In ancient Israelite culture, hair carried spiritual weight. The Nazarite vow forbade cutting hair entirely. Samson's strength famously lived in his uncut hair, but the point wasn't magical strands. It was obedience. The hair was proof of devotion to God. When it was cut, the vow was broken, and everything fell apart. Mourning rituals involved shaving the head or beard. Grief made visible, loss displayed publicly, and priests had strict rules. No shaving like pagans, no wild styles. Discipline mattered. Hair reflected faithfulness or deviation, and prophets sometimes wore their hair oddly on purpose as living symbols of disruption. Now drift north again toward the Scythians and steppe cultures, where mobility shaped everything. Hair here had to move with you. Braids were practical, protective, symbolic. Warriors wore long hair braided tightly, sometimes adorned with beads or metal. These weren't decorations. They marked achievements, status, kills, and burial practices preserved hair carefully. Bodies were laid to rest with their hairstyles intact, as if identity needed to remain recognizable beyond death. And maybe it did. Across the ancient world, shaving was never neutral. It could mean punishment, mourning, devotion, humiliation, or renewal. And growing hair could mean rebellion, power, holiness, or madness. Context was everything. This is why ancient texts mention hair so often, almost obsessively, because everyone understood what it meant, even if they pretended not to. Take ancient monks again, across multiple cultures. Buddhist monks shaved their heads to detach from desire. Jain monks plucked their hair out by hand during initiation, a slow, painful act meant to sever attachment completely. Early Christian ascetics followed similar paths, shaving, matting, neglecting hair entirely to reject vanity. The body became something to discipline. Hair was the first battlefield, and yet, even rejection became identity. The shaved head became recognizable, a uniform of renunciation. Even when trying to escape society, humans still marked themselves. Now let's drift quietly into ancient courts again, because courts were where hair rules became especially suffocating. In imperial China, court regulations specified hairstyle lengths, accessories, who could wear what. Wrong hair could end careers or lives. Officials wore caps to conceal top knots. Uniformity mattered. The emperor's appearance set the standard. And when dynasties changed, hairstyles changed too. Not immediately, not cleanly, but eventually. And resistance often began with hair. Refusing a mandated style was refusing legitimacy. In ancient Korea, men wore their hair in top knots once married, marking adulthood and responsibility. To cut it was shameful. Women braided their hair differently before and after marriage. Hairpins became symbols of status, and mourning again brought shaving or unbinding. Hair responded to life. In Southeast Asia, Hindu and Buddhist influences shaped hair rituals. Temple offerings included hair. Shaving pilgrimages marked devotion. Kings wore elaborate crowns over carefully managed hair to show divine favor. And again, monks shaved everything away. And always, beneath all of this, was the body itself, a body that aged, grew, shed hair, went gray. And ancient societies noticed this too. Gray hair meant wisdom or decline, or both. Texts commented on it. Poetry lingered on it. Kings feared it, dyed it, hid it, because aging threatened authority. And hair was the first visible sign. Women were often pressured to conceal age through hair. Younger styles, younger colors, younger arrangements, because fertility mattered, and hair was visual fertility. But older women sometimes adopted severe style, signaling withdrawal from sexuality into authority, or piety, or bitterness, depending on who was writing about them. Hair loss itself carried meaning. Baldness could be mocked, or respected, or spiritual. In ancient Greece, bald philosophers were sometimes seen as more thoughtful, less vain. In Rome, baldness was often ridiculed. Julius Caesar famously obsessed over his thinning hair, wearing laurel wreaths, not just for honor, but coverage, because even dictators have insecurities, and hair exposed them. Across the ancient world, cutting hair marked transitions: birth, puberty, marriage, death, before battle, after defeat, before pilgrimage, after mourning. It was time made visible. And because it was visible, it was controlled. And because it was controlled, it became powerful. This is why conquerors targeted hair. They shaved heads, enforced styles, mocked traditions, because changing how people wore their hair changed how they saw themselves. And ancient people understood this instinctively. They resisted with braids, with hidden styles, with stubborn refusal, with quiet compliance that masked inner defiance. Hair became survival. And so, as centuries layered over each other, as empires rose and collapsed, as borders shifted and gods changed names, hair remained constant in its importance. It grew, it was cut, it was adorned, it was punished, it was mourned, and through all of it, it carried stories. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, like a low hum beneath history. And we stay with it, still drifting, still listening, as the ancient world continues forward, strand by strand, without stopping. And so it keeps moving, not in circles, not looping back on itself, but flowing forward the way time actually did in the ancient world, slow and layered, with habits carrying on long after their origins were forgotten. Hair kept growing, laws kept being written about it, and people kept attaching meaning to something that never asked for it. Now we drift further, staying within that same long breath of antiquity into the everyday lives of people who weren't kings or priests, but still lived under the weight of these ideas. In villages, towns, and households, hair routines were part of daily rhythm. Children had their hair checked by elders, not just for lice, but for order. A messy head suggested a messy soul, or lazy parenting, or divine disfavor, depending on who you asked. Mothers learned how to braid and bind early, passing techniques down like recipes. These were not creative acts, they were duties. Braids had to be tight enough to last through work, fields, markets, long walks, but not so tight they caused pain, because pain meant tears, and tears meant delay. And delay was a luxury few could afford. In agricultural societies, hair had to coexist with labor. Long, loose hair was beautiful but impractical. So it was wrapped, covered, tucked away beneath scarves or caps. This wasn't modesty in the moral sense, but protection from sun, from dust, from tools. And yet, even then, the way hair was covered mattered. A married woman covered differently than an unmarried one, a widow differently than a wife, a girl differently than a matron. Even without words, villages knew who was who. Among ancient nomadic groups, hair adapted to movement. Braids prevented tangling. Beads and ornaments weren't just decoration, they helped weigh hair down, keeping it manageable in wind and motion. Some steppe cultures believed spirits could travel through hair, so it was braided carefully before sleep or battle, guiding protection. This wasn't superstition in their eyes, it was practical spirituality. You did what kept you alive, and if that meant braiding your hair in a certain way, you did it. Now let's drift back into temples again, because temples were where hair became offering. Hair was one of the few things you could give that was truly part of you. In ancient India, pilgrims shaved their heads as acts of surrender, leaving hair behind at sacred sites, sometimes in massive quantities. This wasn't loss, it was purification. You walked away lighter. In ancient Greece, young girls dedicated locks of hair to goddesses before marriage, acknowledging a shift from childhood to adulthood. The hair was placed on altars, buried, or burned. It didn't matter what happened to it. What mattered was the act, the letting go. In Mesopotamia, hair offerings accompanied prayers for healing, for fertility, for protection from curses. A sick person might cut their hair and offer it to a god, symbolically removing illness from the body. Hair absorbed misfortune, it carried it away. And when the hair was gone, hope remained. And hope in ancient times was often the most valuable thing anyone had. Funerary practices reveal even more. Mourning hair rituals were universal and deeply emotional. In many cultures, mourners cut their hair or shaved their heads entirely. Grief was not meant to be hidden, it was worn. The ordered appearance announced loss before words were spoken. Some women loosened their hair completely, letting it fall wild and unbound. This visual disorder mirrored inner chaos. Men tore out beards or let them grow unkempt, refusing grooming as a rejection of normal life, because life, for a moment, had stopped making sense. Ancient texts describe widows shaving their heads, marking permanent change. In some cultures, hair would not be cut again until mourning ended, which could take months or years. And when it did end, the next haircut was ceremonial, a return to society, a quiet re-entry into the living world. Hair also marked punishment, not just mourning. Criminals were shaved to mark them visibly. Adulterers, slaves who disobeyed, prisoners of war. The shaved head followed them through streets, announcing guilt or defeat. Even after release, the growing hair reminded everyone of what had happened. Punishment didn't end when the sentence did. It lingered in appearance, and appearance shaped treatment. Conquerors understood this deeply. This is why forced hairstyles were among the first policies imposed after conquest. The Assyrians shaved captives. The Persians humiliated enemies by cutting beards. The Romans paraded shaved prisoners through triumphs. Each act stripped identity and displayed dominance, not through bloodshed, but through humiliation. And sometimes humiliation cut deeper. But people resisted quietly. They hid small braids beneath coverings. They preserved old styles within households. They taught children traditions in secret. Hair grew back. That was its quiet power. You could cut it once, but it would return, and with it, memory. In ancient storytelling and myth, hair often carried supernatural weight. Medusa's snakes were corrupted hair. Punishment turned visible, a warning and a source of terror. Greek nymphs were described with flowing hair that blended into nature itself. Their hair was water, leaves, light. It marked them as liminal beings between worlds. In Hindu mythology, Shiva's matted hair held the Ganges itself, containing destructive force within ascetic control. Hair became cosmic container, not passive, not inert, but active. Ancient poets lingered on hair endlessly, describing lovers by the way light caught their curls, or the scent of oils used to groom them. These descriptions weren't shallow, they were intimate. Hair was closeness, touch, allowed contact. In societies where physical intimacy was restricted, hair became substitute, the brushing of it, the arranging of it, the washing of it. These acts carried emotional weight and were often limited to family or spouses. Touching hair meant trust. This is why public hair washing in some cultures was scandalous. To expose hair in that way suggested availability, or impropriety, or rebellion, and again, context mattered. Now drift back into royal households, because that's where hair obsession reached almost absurd levels. Royal children had their hair managed from birth. Nurses monitored growth styles, chosen not by parents but by tradition or astrologers. Some cultures delayed first haircuts until auspicious dates. Kings believed their child's fate could be influenced by when and how hair was first cut. Celebrations marked these events, feasts, gifts, offerings, because the future of dynasties rested on tiny heads and the hair that grew upon them. Court barbers held immense trust. They knew secrets. They touched kings daily. They observed age, sickness, stress. Hair thinning was noted and whispered about, because a king losing hair was a king losing vitality. And that frightened courts built on appearance of eternal strength. Some rulers dyed hair, some wore wigs, some styled strategically. None admitted it, because admitting weakness was dangerous. Queens and noblewomen endured elaborate styling sessions that lasted hours, not for pleasure, but obligation. Heavy ornaments strained necks, oils irritated skin, but appearance mattered more than comfort. To appear effortless took effort, and that effort was invisible by design. Women who rejected these norms were criticized or labeled unfeminine or dangerous, and yet some did anyway, choosing simplicity as quiet defiance. In ancient Rome, women followed hairstyle trends dictated by empresses, towering curls, braided crowns, intricate constructions supported by wire and padding. These styles weren't practical, they were statements, wealth, time, access to skilled slaves. When fashions changed, older styles marked you as outdated, and being outdated at court was risky. You could fade quickly. Hair dye existed everywhere. Henna in Egypt and India, lead-based dyes in Rome and Greece, because safety was rarely a concern. Lightening, darkening, gray coverage. None of this is modern. People have always feared aging, and hair showed age mercilessly. And so they fought it with whatever they had, and beneath all of this, there was always the natural cycle. Hair fell out, it broke, it thinned, it grayed, and ancient medicine had explanations, humors, imbalances, divine will. Remedies ranged from oils and herbs to prayers and spells. Some worked, some didn't, but hope remained. As we keep drifting, the pattern becomes clear. Hair was never about vanity alone. It was about belonging, about control, about survival, about marking time. And even those who tried to escape society entirely, hermits and ascetics living in caves or forests, were identified by their hair, matted, untouched, wild, not groomed, not cut. This wasn't neglect. It was statement. I am no longer part of you. And yet society still watched, still labeled, still interpreted. In the ancient world, nothing escaped meaning, not even something as simple as hair, and maybe especially not something so visible, so intimate, so changeable. It grew quietly while empires roared, but when empires fell, hair remained, still growing on the heads of people who remembered. And so it carries us forward, not looping, not repeating exactly, but evolving as ancient life did, slowly, inevitably, strand by strand, through time that never stopped moving. It moves onward again, not turning back, not retelling the same strand twice, but stretching further into how these ideas settled into ordinary time where nothing dramatic happened and yet everything mattered. In households across ancient lands, hair routines became invisible rules, followed without question. A child woke, a mother checked the scalp, a comb moved slowly, deliberately, because pulling too hard meant tears, and tears meant disorder. And disorder in a world obsessed with signs and omens was never taken lightly. People believed the body spoke before the mouth ever did, and hair was one of its loudest languages. Oil was warmed between palms before touching the head. This was not luxury, it was maintenance. Dry hair cracked, broke, invited illness or parasites. And parasites were not just unpleasant, they were shameful. They implied neglect, and neglect implied moral failure. So care was constant, quiet, daily, and usually unnoticed by those who benefited from it most. In river civilizations, hair absorbed scent, mud, water, smoke, fish. In response, herbs were crushed into pastes, not for beauty, but cleansing. Some mixtures darkened hair, some lightened it slightly, others stiffened it. These effects became associated with class or region, even when unintended. So appearance slowly hardened into identity. People began to say, this group looks like this, that group like that, and from there, judgments followed. Travelers were immediately identifiable by hair. Foreign styles stood out before accents did. A man entered a town, and before he spoke, people knew he did not belong. They knew by the cut, by the way he was tied, by what was missing or present. And so hair controlled access to trust, to trade, to marriage. In many places, outsiders were required to alter their hair to stay. This was framed as assimilation, but it was really surveillance. When you look like everyone else, you are easier to watch. Among warriors, hair carried fear. Some cut it short to prevent enemies from grabbing it. Others grew it long to intimidate, letting it fly loose in battle. Paint mixed with grease stiffened it into shapes that made the body look larger, more animal, more dangerous. This was psychological warfare long before the term existed, and it worked because fear begins in the eyes and hair frames the face. Yet after battle, hair was tended again, cleansed, rebraided, reordered. Chaos was temporary. Order always returned. That was the promise societies tried to keep, that even after violence, there was grooming, there was routine, there was restoration. In priestly classes, hair routines were ritualized further. Some temples demanded absolute uniformity. Every priest shaved the same way, on the same schedule. This erased individuality in favor of role. You were not you. You were function, and hair reminded you of that daily. Other cults did the opposite, allowing hair to grow untouched as proof of devotion. Time itself was etched into length. The longer the hair, the longer the faith. This created visible hierarchies. A newly initiated priest looked different from an elder, not by age lines, but by inches. Society read these cues instantly, no introductions required. The body announced status before the voice ever could. Children learned early what was permitted. Boys were told when their hair would be cut. Girls were told when it would be bound. The waiting mattered. A haircut marked time, a birthday, a right, a loss, freedom, or sometimes a gain, and anticipation built quietly. Haircuts were not casual, they were thresholds. In some regions, children were threatened with haircutting as punishment. Not pain, but humiliation. To be shorn unexpectedly meant loss of dignity. So obedience was enforced not with blows, but with fear of alteration. And that fear stayed. As populations grew and cities expanded, hair markets appeared. Wigs, extensions, false braids. Not because people wanted novelty, but because status demanded consistency. A noblewoman could not be seen with thinning hair. A priest could not appear unkempt. A ruler could not show age. So substitutes emerged, ancient solutions to ancient anxieties. The materials varied: human hair, animal hair, plant fibers, and with them came trade, regulation, theft, because hair had value, not metaphorical, actual, measurable value. Slaves captured in war sometimes had their hair harvested. This was not recorded as cruelty. It was commerce. The hair traveled, far from its owner, used to build the appearance of another, and no one spoke of the loss. This silence tells its own story. Illness changed hair. Fever caused shedding. Malnutrition dulled shine. And communities noticed. Healers examined hair before pulses. They read weakness in texture. They diagnosed imbalance by breakage, and treatments followed. Oils, fasting, rest. Some worked, some didn't. But again, the attempt mattered. It showed care, and care was social glue. In droughts and famines, hairstyles simplified. There was no time, no oil, no patience. Braids became fewer, shorter, more practical, and these changes marked hardship. Long after food returned, elders remembered those years by how people looked. The famine hair, the war hair, memories stored in appearance. As generations passed, myths hardened into customs. No one remembered why a certain braid meant widowhood, only that it did, and so it continued. Tradition does not require understanding, it requires repetition, and hair was easy to repeat, now drift again into borderlands, places between empires, where cultures mixed and hair reflected it. Hybrid styles emerged, braids combined with shaved sections, or foreign ornaments worn with local cuts. These were not political statements, they were practical adaptations. But rulers hated them. They blurred categories, and blurred categories threatened control. So laws followed, banning certain styles, requiring others, and suddenly hair became legal territory. Punishments escalated, fines, shaving, imprisonment. But people adapted, they always did. Hidden braids, under caps, under veils, under helmets. Hair is patient, it waits. In desert regions, Hair protection mattered more than display, wrapped tightly, covered constantly. But when uncovered, it carried prestige. Shine signaled health, and health signaled survival. In these environments, weak hair meant weakness, and weakness meant vulnerability. So grooming was survival strategy. In colder climates, hair provided insulation. Beards were practical, wrapped against wind. Men who shaved suffered. Women whose hair thinned struggled. So styles evolved to preserve warmth. Function shaped fashion long before fashion claimed autonomy. Across oceans and mountains, the pattern holds. Hair always responded to environment, and environment shaped belief, and belief shaped law, and law shaped bodies. This chain never broke, it just stretched. Now consider aging, because aging terrified ancient elites just as much as it does anyone. Graying hair was a problem. It contradicted ideals of strength. Wisdom was praised, but weakness was not. So dyes persisted, some derived from plants, some from minerals, some toxic, some dangerous, but used anyway, because appearing old was sometimes more dangerous than poisoning yourself slowly. Women bore this pressure more intensely. Aging hair meant fading relevance, and relevance was survival. So elaborate coverings emerged, veils, headdresses, structures that hid what could not be fixed. And these coverings became virtues, modesty, tradition, decorum, but beneath them was fear, fear of disappearance. Men hid age through beards. A thick beard concealed sagging skin, gray blended into texture, strategic neglect masquerading as philosophy. And society accepted it because wisdom had to look a certain way, and hair helped create that illusion. In storytelling, villains were often marked by hair, disorder, excess, odd colors. Heroes were neat, or intentionally wild but controlled. The visual language was clear even to those who could not read, and so children learned morality through appearance long before doctrine. As trade expanded, hair knowledge traveled. Oils from one region adopted by another, combs exchanged, braiding techniques shared, and slowly styles migrated. But meanings did not always travel with them, so misunderstandings occurred. A style sacred in one place became decorative in another, and offense followed. But time smoothed it over. It usually does. Through all this, hair kept growing, unconcerned with empires, with gods, with laws. It grew, and people reacted. That was the relationship, constant, unequal, but intimate. And as ancient centuries layered upon each other, these practices became sediment. They pressed down into culture, so deep that even when beliefs shifted, habits remained. People forgot why, they only remembered how. And hair, obedient and stubborn at once, continued to be shaped by hands that inherited movements older than memory itself. It keeps stretching forward, not repeating itself, not circling back, but settling deeper into how these meanings hardened with time until they felt natural, inevitable, unquestioned. By now, in the ancient world, no one was asking why hair mattered. They only knew that it did. And that knowing shaped lives quietly, persistently, from birth until death. In many places, the first thing done to a newborn was not naming, but touching the head. A blessing, a mark, a gesture meant to guide what would grow next. Hair was future potential made visible, and elders watched it closely. Growth was commented on. Too fast meant imbalance. Too slow meant weakness. Every change was read as sign, And so childhood was accompanied by constant observation, not cruelty, attention, because survival depended on reading bodies correctly. And hair was among the easiest parts to read. As children aged, restrictions increased, freedom narrowed. What was once allowed was now forbidden. A girl who once ran with loose hair was told to bind it. A boy who once wore it long was told to cut it. The transition was rarely explained. It didn't need to be. Tradition speaks without justification. And children learned quickly that compliance brought praise while deviation brought correction. This shaped posture, behavior, self perception. Hair taught people where they stood before anyone told them, and once learned, that lesson rarely faded. In adolescence, hair became tension. Desire pulled against rule. Younger generations experimented quietly. A strand left loose, a braid worn differently, oil scented with something unfamiliar. These were small rebellions. But small rebellions were often the only ones possible, and elders noticed. They always did, but sometimes they pretended not to, because every generation tests the boundaries, and every society needs pressure, release. Marriage was the next great transformation. Hair marked it unmistakably, bound more tightly, covered more fully, or in some cultures, displayed more prominently, now permitted to attract because purpose had shifted from innocence to alliance. Hair announced availability, and then, just as clearly, it announced closure. Once married, styles changed again, more restrained, more controlled. The body belonged not just to self anymore, but to household, lineage. Widowhood reversed some of this, but not all. A widow's hair announced loss, but also danger. She was between roles, and societies are uncomfortable with in between. So rules multiplied. What she could wear, how she could groom, how long mourning lasted, and hair carried the burden of that uncertainty, visibility without power, visibility without protection. Among men, transitions were tied to rank. A boy became a warrior when his hair changed. A novice became elder when beard filled in. A ruler was crowned with hair arranged just so. Every step upward or downward was marked physically. And because hair grows slowly, these transitions were not sudden. They stretched, time made visible. Now drift toward border rituals, passages between spaces, mountains, rivers, gates. Before crossing, people adjusted hair. They covered it, tied it differently, or loosened it. These acts acknowledged transition. You do not cross unchanged. Hair participated in that acknowledgement, silent witness to movement. In pilgrimage traditions, hair often marked distance traveled. The longer the journey, the more ordered the appearance. Some vowed not to cut hair until return. Length became proof, devotion measured in months, and when pilgrims returned, changed and weathered, hair told the story before mouths did. In warfare, capture meant transformation. Prisoners were shaved or marked. This wasn't hygiene, it was erasure, a way to reset identity. But even then, captives sometimes resisted by preserving small sections, hidden tufts, braids close to scalp, memory clinging stubbornly. And when escape happened, hair regrowth marked recovery, slowly but undeniably. Now look again at artisans, because hair influenced craft too. Weavers embroidered hair motifs, potters shaped figures with specific styles, sculptors carved curls with symbolic precision. These were not aesthetic choices alone, they encoded information. Viewers knew what they were seeing: a married woman, a god, a foreigner, a traitor. Art communicated hair language fluently. Coins bore rulers with idealized hair, not necessarily accurate, but aspirational, strength captured in metal. This mattered because coins traveled, and wherever they went, the ruler's hair went too, projecting authority through curls and waves. People who never saw a king still knew his hairstyle, and thus knew his identity. In literature, insults targeted hair. Calling someone bald meant weakness. Calling someone overly groomed meant decadence. Calling someone wild haired meant madness. Language reflected values, and humor followed the same rules. Mockery reinforced norms, because laughter polices behavior efficiently. Illness and age disrupted these ideals, and disruptions caused anxiety. So people sought control through ritual. Some slept with charms tied into hair, others avoided cutting on certain days. Fear turned into habit, habit into tradition, and tradition into law. Natural disasters amplified this. When plague struck, hair rituals intensified. Some shaved to purify. Others refused to cut to appease gods. There was no consensus, but there was urgency, because when answers fail, action replaces understanding, and hair was something you could act upon. As cities grew denser, public appearance mattered more. Seeing strangers daily meant constant judgment. Hair became shorthand: trustworthy, untrustworthy, local, foreign. The eye categorized before thought, and once categorized, behavior followed. This created stereotypes that one group wore hair this way, so they must be like this. And stereotypes hardened into prejudice, but they started small, with observation, with pattern recognition, with hair. Over centuries, empires tried to standardize appearance. Uniformity promised control, but complete uniformity never worked. People always adapted, added small deviations, preserved identity in detail, and hair allowed detail, even within rules. A slight twist, a hidden braid, a particular oil scent. Identity survives in margins. Now drift toward isolation. Monasteries, hermits, secluded scholars. These individuals rejected society's hair language, but even rejection created its own code. A shaved head meant devotion. A wild mane meant renunciation. Every choice still meant something, because meaning clings to the human body, whether invited or not. Solitude did not erase identity, it redefined it, and hair bore the mark of that redefinition. In families, hair memory passed through touch. Grandmothers braiding granddaughters, hands repeating movements learned decades earlier, no words needed. Muscle memory carried culture more reliably than speech. When languages shifted, when borders moved, when rulers changed, hands remembered. This is why hair traditions outlasted empires. You could burn books, topple statues, but you could not erase how people braided hair in private spaces. Culture hid there, in routine, in repetition, in care. As centuries accumulated, some meanings faded, but gestures remained. People performed them without knowing origin. But the feeling persisted: rightness, wrongness. Hair felt wrong when styled incorrectly, and that feeling guided behavior more strongly than law ever could. And so the ancient world carried on. Hair growing, cut, bound, loosened, mourned, adorned, punished, rewarded. Not looping, not repeating exactly, but echoing. patterns shifting slowly. Nothing dramatic needed to happen for history to unfold. All it required was time, and hair provided a way to see that time move, not in dates, not in battles, but in length, in texture, in change measured by fingers and combs and mirrors that were nothing more than polished metal reflecting a face shaped by everything that came before. It continues onward, deeper into the slow fabric of ancient life, where nothing announces itself as history while it is happening. People did not know they were preserving traditions. They were simply repeating what worked, what felt correct, what had always been done. And hair remained one of the most quietly regulated parts of that repetition. So constant it faded into the background while still shaping everything around it. In every settlement, there were unspoken rules. Children absorbed them without instruction. They watched, they copied, and copying was how belonging was learned. In communal spaces, wells, bathhouses, marketplaces, hair was observed casually but constantly. No one stared openly, but glances registered condition, style, order. A woman with unbound hair at the wrong time drew attention. A man with an improper cut raised questions, not accusation, just questions. And questions could be dangerous. Suspicion grew easily in dense communities where survival depended on cohesion. So conformity was not enforced loudly, it was enforced through looks, and hair received many looks. Grooming spaces were social spaces. Hair was rarely cared for alone. Sisters brushed sisters, mothers groomed daughters, servants attended mistresses. These moments were quiet but intimate. Conversations happened, their secrets passed, and knowledge transferred, not just how to braid, but how to behave, how to endure, how to accept roles. Hair care was education disguised as routine. Among the elderly, hair marked authority. White hair commanded respect, not because of beauty, but because it meant survival. You had lived, you had seen cycles return, and people listened to those who endured. Hair aging was not hidden among common folk, it was worn plainly, and that plainness became dignity. In contrast, elites often tried to delay this visible transition, but even they could not escape it entirely. So rituals evolved to reframe age. Gray hair became wisdom, long beards became gravitas, style compensated where youth faded, and society agreed to read it that way because stability required believing elders still belonged at the center. Now drift toward the edges of cities, slums, outskirts, working quarters. There, practicality dominated. Hair was cut shorter, tied tighter, cleaned less frequently because water was scarce or time was limited. This was not neglect, it was adaptation. But elites read it as moral failure. And so class distinctions hardened, visible on the head before anywhere else. This fed resentment, not always spoken, but felt. People knew they were judged by appearance, and appearance was shaped by circumstance. So inequality became embodied, literally worn, and hair was one of its clearest signs. In response, some communities reclaimed pride through distinct styles. Workers wore hair in ways that signaled strength, endurance, identity. They rejected elite aesthetics not by choice, but by necessity, and necessity became culture. Festivals disrupted norms temporarily. During celebrations, hair loosened. or was decorated. Colorful threads, flowers, ash, paint. These moments allowed release. People stepped outside daily roads briefly, and hair mirrored that freedom. But when festivals ended, order returned, hair was retied, restored, and life resumed. These cycles mattered. They prevented fracture. They reminded people that flexibility existed, but only within limits, and hair was the marker of those limits. In border rituals and oath ceremonies, hair was sometimes cut as pledge, not all of it. A lock, a strand, the offering bound words to body. Breaking the oath meant more than dishonor. It meant betraying something physically given. And people remembered that when tempted to stray, travelers carried hair customs with them, but travel changed hair. Sun, wind, salt, water altered texture, and when travelers returned, their hair told of distance traveled. Foreign exposure became visible, and sometimes admired, sometimes distrusted, but never ignored. In trade hubs, styles blended faster. People saw variation daily, and tolerance grew out of familiarity. Hair there became less rigid, but never meaningless. It simply spoke more languages. Now consider captivity again, not war captivity, but debt servitude, bondage, punishment, work sentences. Hair marked duration. Some sentences required shaving at start and letting hair regrow until release. The length became calendar. No numbers needed. Body tracked time. And when hair reached a certain point, freedom approached, hope measured in inches. This made hair emotionally charged. For those waiting, for those watching, and release ceremonies often included grooming, a bath, a cut, a restoration of dignity before reintegration into society. Because society understood that appearance eased transition. Religion continued to shape hair codes subtly. Over generations, spiritual justifications softened into tradition. What was once divine command became social expectation. But consequences remained: punishment for deviation, loss of status, exclusion. These pressures ensured continuity even when belief wavered, and belief did waver. People doubted, gods disappointed, calamity struck despite rituals, but hair rules persisted because they were not only religious, they were social, and social rules are harder to dismantle. In healing rituals, hair again played role. Healers sometimes cut hair to remove illness or burned it to prevent return. These acts provided closure even when cures failed. People needed symbols, and hair provided tangible action. Dream interpretation also involved hair. Dreaming of cutting hair could mean loss, power, shame. Dreaming of growth meant prosperity. These interpretations reinforced waking anxieties, and hair crossed boundary between conscious and unconscious life seamlessly. In storytelling around hearths, elders warned children through hair metaphors. Don't let your hair become wild meant don't lose control. Keep your hair in order meant behave. These sayings survived longer than their origins. They became language. As populations migrated due to climate or conflict, hair traditions traveled, compressed, bits were lost, others exaggerated, styles simplified, then re-elaborated. This constant adaptation prevented stagnation, but continuity remained recognizable. People could trace lineage through grooming methods even when names changed. In artisan guilds, apprentices often adopted specific hairstyles to mark status, not full members, not novices. In between, hair communicated progression without words. and guilds valued that clarity because hierarchy prevents conflict, and hair made hierarchy visible. Punitive shaving sometimes backfired. People sympathized with the shorn rather than authorities. Humiliation generated solidarity, so rulers learned restraint. Not every crime warranted shaving. Control required calibration. And hair policies reflected the learning curve. In royal households, again, succession anxiety manifested in grooming. Children were styled to resemble ancestors. Visual continuity reassured subjects. The ruler may change, but appearance remains. This illusion of permanence mattered deeply. Portraits and reliefs reinforced this. Images froze ideal hair forever. When reality diverged, images compensated. People trusted images, they always have. And hair in art shaped expectation more than observation. As centuries passed, environmental shifts altered hair practices, drought reduced oil availability, cold increased covering. These changes layered onto existing traditions, not replacing them, but bending them. And bending prevented breaking. In oral histories, elders recalled ancestors by hair descriptions. His hair was thick, she wore it braided high. These details anchored memory. People remembered appearance longer than dates. Hair made ancestors tangible. Now drift towards silence, the spaces where hair is not discussed, but still present. Sleep, night, rest. Before sleep, hair was loosened, brushed, or wrapped. These acts prepared body for vulnerability, and vulnerability required ritual, protection through habit. In some beliefs, spirits traveled at night, and hair left loose invited them. So people covered it, tied it, because safety mattered even in rest. And again, hair mediated between seen and unseen. Through all this, nothing dramatic is required. No single event, no climax. History unfolds in repetition, adaptation, memory. Hair is witness to all of it, growing while people age, learning nothing, but recording everything. And so the ancient world continues forward, carried by routines that seem small until viewed across centuries, routines that shaped identity more reliably than decrees. Hair grows, and with it, meaning accumulates quietly, not looping, not returning, but extending endlessly into the lived experience of those who never knew they were history. Only that tomorrow they would wake, touch their heads, and continue doing what had always been done. It carries on quietly, the way ancient life always did, without announcements or pauses, just the steady accumulation of habit layered upon habit, each generation inheriting gestures without asking where they began. Hair remained central to this inheritance because it demanded attention whether one wanted to give it or not. It grew regardless of belief, and so belief followed it. As settlements aged, neighborhoods developed reputations tied to appearance. Some streets were known for neatness, others for roughness, and hair played its part. A tightly bound head suggested discipline. A loose, uneven cut suggested poverty or defiance. These impressions shaped how people were treated long before character could speak, and so hair quietly influenced opportunity, access, trust. In crowded dwellings, grooming became communal again, not out of choice, but necessity. Light was shared, water was rationed, space was limited, so hair care happened together, and togetherness reinforced norms. If everyone around you groomed a certain way, deviation felt uncomfortable even without punishment. Social gravity pulled everyone toward the center. Among craftsmen, hair was adapted to trade. Stoneworkers cut it short to avoid debris. Carpenters tied it tight. Weavers covered it fully to keep fibers clean. These practical choices hardened into identifiers. One could recognize trade by silhouette alone, and pride followed. People wore their profession on their heads without meaning to. In seafaring communities, salt air changed hair texture, coarse, dry, tangled, so oils became essential, and hairstyles adjusted to wind and rope. Function dictated form, and form signaled belonging. If your hair moved correctly in the wind, you belonged. If it didn't, you were new or foreign. Time also brought scarcity, and scarcity simplified everything. Hair rituals shortened, not because meaning faded, but because survival demanded efficiency. But even then, certain gestures remained untouched. A widow still bound her hair. A priest still shaved on schedule. A child still marked coming of age with a cut. These were non-negotiable anchors in uncertain times. Disasters tested belief, floods, fires, earthquakes. Afterward, people sought reasons, and hair rituals intensified. Some cut hair in mourning for the dead. Some refused to cut until rebuilding was complete. These acts gave shape to grief and shape to recovery. Communities needed visible signs that healing was happening, and hair provided gradual proof. In Migration, hair rules were the last to change. People might adopt new foods, new languages, new gods, but hair remained stubbornly familiar. Children born in new lands still wore ancestral styles because parents taught what they knew, and hair was the easiest memory to pass on. This sometimes created tension with authorities. Foreign-looking hair marked communities as other. Suspicion followed, and pressure to conform increased, but conformity threatened memory, so compromises emerged. Hidden styles, private grooming, public coverings, identity folded inward rather than disappearing. In intermarriage, hair became negotiation. Which traditions would children follow? How would they be groomed? Whose lineage would be visible? This mattered deeply because hair announced ancestry before names did, and decisions carried weight for generations. As populations stabilized, festivals regained complexity. Hair decorations became more elaborate, symbolic colors, patterns borrowed from myth. These moments reminded people of shared stories, and hair became moving narrative, carried through streets, seen by all, participated in by many. Artisans who specialized in hair gained status. Braiders, barbers, healers. They knew more than technique. They knew people. They heard confessions, observed decline, growth, change. They became unofficial chroniclers of community life, and their memory outlasted their tools. In some cultures, cutting another's hair without permission was severe offense, not because of loss, but because of violation. Hair was extension of self, and touching it required trust. Thus, consent became ritualized long before language defined it. Children learned this early. Don't touch without asking. Don't mock styles. Don't alter another's appearance. These rules maintained peace, and peace was fragile. With aging populations, caregiving increased. The elderly could no longer groom themselves fully, so others did it for them. This act reversed roles. Children caring for parents, hands repeating motions once received. This continuity softened fear of decline. Hair care became dignity preservation, and dignity mattered until the end. In preparation for death, hair was addressed one last time, washed, combed, arranged, or deliberately left undone, depending on belief. This final state mattered because the dead were seen, and how they were seen reflected on the living. Honor extended beyond breath. Burial practices preserved hair deliberately. Some cultures buried hair intact, some cut it, some preserved locks as relics. These choices reflected beliefs about afterlife, identity carried forward or released. Hair again served as bridge. Over centuries, myths condensed into proverbs. Hair sayings guided behavior without explanation. Don't let your hair lead you astray meant don't follow impulse. Keep your hair clean meant keep your intentions pure. These metaphors endured because everyone understood hair. As trade routes shifted, new materials entered grooming. Combs carved differently. Oils scented differently. These changes refreshed routines without altering meaning. Tradition survived adaptation. That flexibility kept it alive. In courts, fashion cycles accelerated. Rulers adopted styles to mark reigns. A new cut signaled new order, and subjects followed, or pretended to. Hair became political announcement without speech. But outside courts, life remained slower, and hair changed at human pace, inches per year, not decrease per season. This mismatch created tension between authority and reality usually won quietly. Religious schisms sometimes expressed first through hair. Some groups shaved, some refused. Suddenly appearance marked belief, and neighbors noticed. Divisions hardened, visible before doctrine was understood, and reconciliation, when it came, often began with shared grooming rituals, restoring sameness. Throughout all of this, hair never stopped being practical. It still tangled, fell out, grew unevenly, needed care. This grounded symbolism in reality. You could believe many things about hair, but you still had to wash it. And that everyday necessity kept belief from floating too far from life. As literacy spread unevenly, hair remained universal language. People who could not read could still interpret styles. They knew who was mourning, who was married, who was dangerous, who was sacred. This visual literacy sustained social order where writing could not. In times of peace, styles stabilized. In times of stress, variation increased. People experimented more when norms loosened. Stress revealed cracks, and hair slipped through them. Eventually, centuries layered so thickly that origins blurred. No one remembered first reasons, only outcomes. But hair rituals continued because stopping them felt wrong, unsettling, like ignoring a pain. And so the ancient world pressed forward, not driven by grand events, but by daily repetitions carried out by ordinary hands. Hair grew and was met with oil, and comb, and knife, and thread, and belief. These interactions shaped identity more consistently than any law, and as long as people woke, touched their heads, and prepared themselves to face another day under familiar rules, history continued its slow, quiet work, moving forward without loops, without endings, just the steady passage of time written strand by strand on every living head. It moves forward again in the same quiet way as ancient life always did, not marked by declarations but by continuity, by the unremarkable persistence of routines that shaped people more deeply than any single event. Hair remained one of those routines that no one escaped, no matter how small their world or how large their ambition. In every dwelling, from stone houses to temporary shelters, the day began with some acknowledgement of the head, a hand smoothing, a tie adjusted, a covering placed. This act did not announce itself as meaningful, yet meaning accumulated within it over years of repetition. As communities aged, memory settled into gesture Elders no longer explained why certain days were forbidden for cutting hair. They simply enforced the rule because they had been taught the same, and compliance felt safer. Curiosity. In a world where survival depended on harmony, questioning visible customs felt risky. Hair rules endured because they were easy to obey and costly to defy. Among shepherds and farmers, hair reflected seasonality. In planting months, it was kept tighter, shorter, more controlled. There was no time for maintenance. Harvest demanded efficiency. Afterward, hair grew out again. Looser styles returned. Festive elements appeared. This rhythm aligned body with land. People did not need calendars. They watched hair change with work cycles. And that alignment reinforced belonging to place. In river cultures, hair washing followed water rituals. Some days were auspicious, others forbidden. The act of cleansing the head became communal, part of religious calendar. And children learned early that cleanliness was not merely physical, it was spiritual, social, cosmic. Hair was where all three intersected. Among traders who moved constantly, hair rules softened. Practicality overrode symbolism. But even then, certain markers remained: a knot, a bead, a scarf. These small anchors maintained identity amid movement, because without anchors, people feared losing themselves, and hair provided something stable to hold. As cities expanded, anonymity increased, and anonymity made appearance more important. When you no longer knew everyone, you relied on visual cues. Hair became first introduction, strangers judged instantly, trust or distance followed accordingly. And this reinforced grooming norms even more strongly than before. In densely populated quarters, infestations spread easily, and with them came stigma. So, hair inspections became routine, not invasive, just accepted. This normalization of inspection reveals how deeply personal boundaries differed. Hair was public concern because individual neglect endangered group health, and group survival always outweighed individual comfort. Among healers, hair remained diagnostic. They ran fingers through it, listened to complaints, matched texture to symptoms. These observations were recorded mentally, passed down orally. And while explanations varied, the attention itself mattered. It reassured the sick that someone saw change and saw it early. In military camps, hair was regulated strictly, not just for discipline, but for unity. When soldiers looked alike, individuality faded and obedience increased. This was understood intuitively. Even without theory, people behaved differently when stripped of personal markers, and hair was among the easiest to standardize. Yet soldiers personalized anyway: small notches, certain ties, hidden charms. These deviations were tolerated as long as they did not disrupt cohesion. This balance maintained morale, and hair again served as compromise between order and self. Now drift into domestic conflict, marriages where control extended to grooming. Some partners dictated hairstyles as assertion of authority. This was not framed as abuse, but as propriety. But the effect was the same. Hair became site of power struggle, and resistance took form in subtle neglect or quiet alteration, small acts, meaningful. In polygamous households, hair differentiated rank, wives styled differently, concubines differently, children differently. These distinctions reduced conflict by clarifying hierarchy, but they also reinforced inequality daily. Each mirror reminded women of position and acceptance or resentment followed. Over time, some women found agency within these constraints, mastering complex styles, being admired for skill, creating beauty where freedom was limited. Hair became craft, and craft brought respect. Even within restriction, people found ways to matter. In mourning rituals, hair continued to absorb grief. When words failed, gestures spoke, cutting, burning, loosening. These acts externalized pain, and communities recognized them. They responded with support or distance as custom dictated. Grief was regulated. Hair ensured it did not overwhelm social order. As plagues recurred, fear returned, and hair rituals intensified. Some believed illness ended through hair, others believed cutting hair expelled it. Contradictory practices coexisted because certainty was impossible, but action felt necessary, and hair was accessible. In times of political instability, appearance became dangerous. Supporting the wrong faction could be inferred from style, so people neutralized themselves, adopted bland grooming, blended in, survival strategy through invisibility. Hair helped disappear as much as it helped assert. Art continued to codify ideals. Statues preserved perfect hair forever. This contrast with reality created tension. People compared themselves to stone and felt lacking, but aspiration drove grooming industries forward. More oils, more tools, more time invested in appearance, because ideals do not fade easily once carved. In rural areas, art mattered less, tradition more. Hairstyles changed slowly, but meaning remained clear. People knew who belonged, who didn't, who had married, who had lost someone, who had returned from afar. These readings required no explanation. Among storytellers and performers, hair was theatrical. Exaggerated styles signaled roles: villain, hero, trickster. Audience recognition depended on it. These visual cues simplified narrative, and hair became shorthand for morality. Children absorbed these lessons unconsciously. They played games, mimicking styles, assigned roles based on hair arrangement, imagined futures through appearance. Identity formation began early, and hair shaped imagination. In border conflicts, hair sometimes decided fate. A captured scout mistaken for enemy due to style, a traitor spared because appearance matched locals. These moments were rarely recorded, but they mattered deeply to those involved. Life hinged on grooming. As technologies of grooming slowly improved, better blades, smoother combs, hair routines became more refined. But purpose remained unchanged: control, belonging, expression within limits. In monastic settings again, hair routines, structured days, shaving schedules, marking time, physical discipline reinforced mental discipline. The act of removing hair repeatedly reminded monks of impermanence, but also of commitment. You chose this, and hair marked that choice daily. In contrast, mystics allowed hair to grow freely. This visible rejection of order challenged institutions, but also inspired followers, because disorder suggested authenticity, and hair embodied that tension between institution, individual faith. As oral histories accumulated, hair descriptions persisted. They anchored stories in bodies. This made ancestors real, not abstract. People could imagine them because they imagined hair. They knew that texture, that style, and thus felt continuity. In coastal rituals, hair offerings were cast into water, symbolic return to origins, to gods. These acts linked hair with cycles: life, death, return, and water carried memory away visibly. Waves swallowed strands, and people watched as societies aged further. Fatigue set in. People followed rules automatically. Hair rituals became reflex. No thought, no belief, but habit sustained them. This mechanical repetition was enough because meaning had already been embedded deeply and did not require renewal. When new beliefs emerged, they negotiated with hair customs. Some absorbed them, some rejected them, some reinterpreted, but rarely eliminated entirely, because hair traditions were too woven into daily life. To remove them would unravel structure. Thus, ancient worlds transformed slowly, layer upon layer. No clean breaks. Hair practices changed shape, but not function. They continued to regulate identity, visibility, morality, power. And through all of this, time passed, not noticed, not measured by clocks, but by growth, by the need to cut again, by the feel of length at the neck, by the weight of braids on the scalp. This was how people experienced duration. So the ancient world moved forward steadily, not looping, not pausing, carrying its meanings in flesh rather than parchment. Hair grew, and with it, the quiet inheritance of centuries continued, shaping lives, one small gesture at a time, unnoticed, yet undeniable, as people woke each day and did what they had always done without knowing that these simple acts were the threads holding history together. The slow movement continues without announcement, because nothing in the ancient world ever truly announced itself. Changes arrived quietly, folded into habit, absorbed by the body before the mind ever noticed. And hair, still growing at the same patient pace, kept recording those changes, whether people meant it to or not. In villages that had existed longer than anyone could remember, children learned rules without being taught. They watched, they copied, they felt correction when fingers slapped their hands away from blades or oils at the wrong time. Custom lived in muscle memory. As generations passed, hair customs became proof of lineage, not written proof, not sealed proof, but visible proof. When strangers arrived, elders studied them closely. They looked at posture, then hands, then hair, the way it was bound or left loose, the way it reacted to wind, the way it framed the face. These details mattered more than speech. Accents could be faked, clothing could be borrowed, hair told longer stories. In climates where heat dominated, shaved heads were practical, but never purely practical. They were tied to ideas of discipline and endurance. To remove hair was to remove softness, to expose skin to sun and dust willingly. This was admired. It signaled readiness for hardship. And so baldness acquired moral weight. In colder regions, length conveyed resilience. Hair trapped warmth. It layered protection. This necessity evolved into symbolism. Strength became associated with thickness, length with vitality. A man losing hair too early drew concern. Whispers followed: health, fertility, blessing, all questioned quietly, because hair loss was never just hair loss. Among women, hair aging marked transition. Girls wore hair simply loose or lightly tied. Married women changed style visibly, not hidden, but declared. This reduced ambiguity, and ambiguity was dangerous in rigid systems. Clarity preserved order, and hair delivered clarity instantly. Widows altered their hair again, sometimes cutting, sometimes covering, sometimes abandoning decoration. These changes signaled grief without forcing speech. Community response followed automatically. Support, distance. This ritualized response protected everyone. It gave structure to emotion. Among artisans, hair often bore traces of labor, oils, dust, metal shavings. These marks were not cleaned away fully. They signaled trade, pride lived there. A craftsman's hair told his skill before his hands were ever seen. And clients judged accordingly. In markets, vendors used hair to attract. Customers trusted familiarity, a familiar braid, a familiar knot. People returned to what looked right. Hair became branding long before the concept existed. Among performers again, hair exaggeration persisted, but over time styles standardized. Audience expectation shaped appearance. This created feedback. Performers adjusted hair to applause. Applause reinforced norms. Hairstyles stabilized. This is how culture settled. Through repetition, rewarded in agricultural rites, hair offerings continued. Children's first cuts dedicated. Fields blessed with strands, tied to posts, buried at edges. These acts were believed to bind human growth to crop growth. This belief endured because sometimes harvest was good and coincidence was enough. As belief systems overlapped, contradictions multiplied. Some shaved, some grew, some covered, some decorated. All claimed legitimacy. Conflict arose, not from difference but from exclusivity. When one group declared their hair way superior, tension followed, but coexistence often resumed because daily survival mattered more than ideology. In borderlands, hybrid styles emerged, practical blends, symbolic compromises. These regions innovated quietly. They taught that rigid rules softened under pressure. Hair customs proved adaptable even when beliefs resisted. In elite households, grooming became ceremony. Servants trained meticulously, mistakes punished. Hair of nobles was extension of power. Imperfection reflected badly, not just on individual but on household. This pressure trickled downward. Servants adopted similar standards for themselves because proximity to power reshaped expectations. Children raised in such environments learned self surveillance early. They corrected themselves before correction arrived. This internalization ensured continuity, without force, without explanation. In contrast, isolated communities retained older forms. They resisted external influence, not aggressively, but passively. They simply continued. This continuity confused outsiders, but stability protected them. They saw no reason to change what worked. As time moved, stories accumulated around hair. Myths explained origins. Why one group shaved, why another braided, why another covered. These myths filled gaps left by forgotten history. People remembered meaning even when origin vanished, and that was enough. In legal settings, hair sometimes served as evidence, not scientifically, but symbolically. A disheveled head implied guilt. A groomed one implied innocence. Judgment followed appearances because objectivity was scarce, and humans rely on shortcuts. Punishments involving hair removal reinforced authority. Public acts created spectacle, but spectacle reinforced memory, and memory reinforced obedience. Hair punishment was temporary yet lasting. The humiliation lingered longer than hair took to grow back. Yet forgiveness also involved hair. Restoration ceremonies allowed regrowth, allowing hair to return marked reintegration. This balance prevented permanent exclusion. Societies needed flexibility to survive, and hair rituals provided controlled transitions. Among travelers, hair again adapted. They learned local norms quickly, not from instruction, but from observation. They ordered themselves to avoid trouble. Hair taught survival skills faster than language. In storytelling traditions, heroes' hair changed over journeys, cut, shortened, grown. Each stage reflected transformation. Listeners tracked progress visually in imagination. This made stories memorable, hair anchored narrative. Among healers once more, hair treatments evolved, herbs tested, results observed. This empirical approach lacked formal recording, but knowledge persisted through practice. Grandmothers taught daughters, these daughters taught theirs. This chain endured centuries quietly. In times of famine, hair suffered. It thinned, broke, lost shine. These visible signs alerted community before words did. Support mobilized. Not always enough, but recognition mattered. Hair revealed suffering when voices could not. As political systems shifted slowly, hair customs outlived rulers. Dynasties fell. Hair remained. This continuity reassured people that some things were stable, even when authority changed. Hair anchored identity beyond politics. In sacred art, hair representation became stylized, symbolic rather than realistic. This abstraction elevated figures above humanity, but also distanced them. Common people compared themselves and felt small, but aspiration remained. Striving mattered even if unreachable. Among rebels, hair defiance persisted. Unorthodox styles signaled dissent. This visible opposition invited risk, but also solidarity. People recognized allies instantly. Hair functioned as code. As rebellions failed or succeeded, styles faded or spread. History remembered outcomes. Hair remembered emotions. Over centuries, migration blended traditions. Some practices vanished, not erased, but diluted. They lingered in fragments, a braid here, a knot there. These remnants confused later observers but represented survival of memory. Children born into mixed traditions navigated complexity. They learned multiple rules, applied situationally. This flexibility increased resilience. Hair taught adaptability. As belief in fate persisted, hair, omens, multiplied. Cowlicks interpreted. Direction mattered. Placements read. These interpretations offered control illusion. People sought meaning in randomness because unpredictability frightened them. Hair provided patterns to read. In coastal storms, sailors shaved heads, believed it appeased forces. These acts brought comfort if nothing else, and comfort mattered. As old age approached, hair whitened. This change commanded respect, not universally, but often. White hair symbolized endurance, wisdom, survival through hardship. This granted elders authority. Hair legitimized voice. But not all elders were wise. Some abused authority. Hair still protected them. Reverence delayed challenge. This reveals hair's power to obscure as well as reveal. As rituals persisted, people forgot alternatives. They assumed universality, believed their customs eternal. This assumption stabilized society, but hindered innovation. Still, survival prioritized stability. Thus, the ancient world continued forward, Not repeating but accumulating, layered customs building weight, hair grew, and with it, invisible frameworks strengthened. These frameworks shaped thought before thought formed. Daily life remained grounded in these small acts: combing, tying, cutting, covering. These gestures linked past to present seamlessly. No one felt transition. History flowed uninterrupted. And so the days continued, each indistinguishable yet unique, marked not by dates or declarations, but by growth measured at the scalp, by the quiet necessity of tending to what everyone carried with them always, the ever present, ever changing record of belonging, belief, and endurance, moving steadily onward without pause, without return, simply continuing as ancient life always did. The continuation settles into the same steady rhythm, because ancient life never hurried and never waited, it simply moved. The days stacked themselves one on top of another, and hair kept growing in quiet obedience to time. People woke, adjusted what had grown, and stepped back into the same world that had shaped their parents and would shape their children. In this way, continuity did not need to be explained. It was lived. As trade routes widened, strangers passed through familiar paths more often, and with them came unfamiliar grooming habits. Some wore hair tighter, some looser, some covered in ways not previously seen. At first, these differences caused pause, not hostility, just attention. People looked longer, they whispered. Then they returned to their work. But seeds of curiosity were planted, and curiosity slowly softened. Rigidity. Children noticed first. They imitated playfully. They wrapped hair differently. They copied knots they barely understood. Elders corrected them sometimes, but not always. Some deviations slipped through, and those slips mattered. They accumulated quietly, and what once felt foreign slowly felt optional. In inns, in rest houses, shared spaces, forced negotiation. No one controlled another's hair here. Compromise emerged out of necessity. People learned tolerance through proximity, not ideology, but habit. Hairstyles mingled over meals, and coexistence became normal. Among travelers, stories circulated about distant customs. Some exaggerated, some misunderstood, but all reinforced the idea that hair held meaning everywhere. This universality comforted people. It suggested shared humanity beneath difference, and that softened fear. In healing sanctuaries, hair rituals, blended belief systems, healers adopted practices that seemed effective regardless of origin. They shaved, some braided, some anointed. These choices followed results, not doctrine, and patients accepted anything that brought relief. Hair became experimental space where rigid belief loosened. As communities grew wealthier, grooming time increased. Decoration expanded. Beauty standards refined. This refinement increased pressure. People compared themselves more often. Insecurity followed. But aspiration also grew, and with it, industries of adornment expanded quietly within limits of available resources. In poorer quarters, simplicity persisted, not always by choice, but necessity shaped aesthetics too. Cleanliness mattered more than decoration. Function outweighed symbolism, yet dignity remained. People found pride in restraint. Hair reflected endurance rather than excess. Among ruling elites, hair again grew heavier with expectation. Courts scrutinized appearance relentlessly. Fashions shifted slowly but deliberately. Imitation flowed downward. This trickle shaped entire populations without command. No one ordered change. People copied power instinctively, Servants spent hours preparing their master's hair. Perfection was demanded. This labor was invisible, yet exhausting. But mastery of technique brought quiet authority. Servants knew secrets. They touched heads no one else could, and that proximity carried subtle power. Children raised near power absorbed grooming discipline early. They learned stillness, patience, acceptance. These traits shaped character. Hair routines trained obedience before law ever did. In education settings, teachers enforced grooming rules as discipline. These rules seemed unrelated to learning, but order mattered. Straight hair symbolized straight thinking. This association persisted without challenge. As belief in destiny continued, hair divination persisted. Strands examined, curls interpreted, directions noted. These readings offered reassurance. People preferred meaning to randomness. Hair provided patterns when life felt chaotic. In times of drought, rituals intensified. Hair offerings increased. Some shaved entirely, some grew intentionally. These extremes reflected desperation. Action felt better than waiting, and hair was always available. In coastal communities, salt stiffened hair, texture changed. These physical differences reinforced regional identity. People recognized origin instantly. Hair carried geography. In mountainous regions, wind-shaped styles, practical adaptations evolved into tradition. People defended them fiercely because adaptation had become identity. As storytelling passed orally, hair descriptions anchored memory. Listeners imagined ancestors vividly. This visualization strengthened lineage bonds. People felt continuity through appearance imagined across generations. In marriage negotiations, hair was assessed. Families judged health, fertility, character, all inferred visually. These judgments were flawed, but accepted. They simplified complex decisions. Women learned to present hair strategically. They understood perception. They manipulated expectations subtly. This was not rebellion, but navigation. Hair offered leverage within constraint. Men too adjusted styles to signal maturity, readiness, authority. These signals reduced conflict. They clarified social roles. Hair prevented misunderstanding. In mourning periods, hair neglect was expected. Carelessness signaled loss. Community allowed it temporarily. This permission was important. It acknowledged pain without words. When mourning ended, restoration rituals followed. Cleaning, cutting, braiding anew. This marked return to life. Community welcomed mourners back visibly. Hair managed transitions gently. As populations expanded, sanitation concerns grew. Hair inspections became common. These inspections were normalized. Not invasive, just practical. Health justified intrusion, and people accepted it. Among ascetics, hair discipline varied. Some shaved relentlessly, some refused cutting altogether. These extremes marked devotion visibly. Followers recognized commitment instantly. Hair measured faith publicly. In contrast, skeptics mocked extremes quietly. They whispered, but rarely challenged openly. Hair debates rarely escalated into open conflict. They remained personal judgments. As seasons repeated, rituals repeated, but subtle changes crept in. Oils changed sources, tools improved, skills refined. These improvements altered experience without altering meaning. People felt progress without naming it. In border conflicts, again, hair misidentification caused tragedy, and caution increased. Neutral styles spread, safety through ambiguity. Hair became camouflage. Over time, this neutrality influenced aesthetics. Blandness became respectable, modesty valued. This shift reflected insecurity. Periods of instability favored invisibility. When stability returned, decoration returned. People expressed relief through adornment. Hair blossomed with confidence. This cycle repeated across centuries. Among elders, hair care slowed. They required assistance. This dependency reversed roles. Children tended parents. This act reinforced respect. Caring for hair became care for legacy. In funeral preparations, hair received final attention, washed, combed, arranged. This last act honored life. Community witnessed closure. Hair framed memory one last time. Graves sometimes included hair offerings. These strands connected living to dead. Physical link preserved. Grief softened through ritual. As myths evolved, hair gained supernatural attributes: strength, memory, power. These stories reinforced existing practices. They justified tradition with narrative. People obeyed more easily when meaning felt cosmic. In isolated monasteries, hair schedules marked time. Shaving days punctuated months. This rhythm replaced external calendars. Hair growth became timekeeping device in agricultural calendars. Children's first haircuts aligned with planting or harvest. This alignment symbolized integration into labor cycle. Hair marked social inclusion. As literacy slowly spread in limited circles, written descriptions of hair appeared. These texts preserved ideals. They froze style in ink, but reality continued evolving. Text lagged behind practice. This gap created tension. People compared themselves to descriptions and felt inadequate, but still tried. Hair aspiration persisted. Among travelers again, adaptation remained key. They learned quickly which styles invited trouble. They adjusted quietly. Hair saved lives. As communities aged, fatigue set in. People followed customs mechanically, but mechanical obedience still worked. Tradition did not require belief to function, it required repetition. This repetition stabilized societies through uncertainty. People held on to small certainties. Hair provided one that was always present, always manageable. As ancient time continued forward, not looping, not returning, each generation inherited practices slightly altered. They did not notice change. They believed continuity, but difference accumulated invisibly. And so the ancient world carried itself onward through centuries without markers or pauses, each morning beginning with the same simple acknowledgement of growth, each evening ending with the same quiet acceptance of routine, hair continuing to grow as it always had, bearing the weight of custom, belief, survival, and identity, moving steadily forward with the people who wore it, never stopping, never repeating, simply unfolding as life always did. Time kept moving forward in that same unannounced way, without declarations or clean divisions, and people continued to live inside customs they rarely questioned. Hair kept growing, and with it grew expectations that felt older than memory. In villages that had existed so long, no one remembered their founding. Elders taught children grooming habits as naturally as speech. No one explained why a braid was tied this way or why a lock was cut at a certain age. It was simply how things were done, and that was enough. As generations passed, minor variations hardened into local tradition. One settlement favored tighter bindings, another allowed looser forms. One shaved earlier, another later. These differences were small but meaningful. They allowed people to recognize belonging instantly. Hair became a badge worn without consent. In marketplaces, strangers were judged silently before a word was spoken. The way hair sat on the head signaled trustworthiness. or danger, or humility. These judgments were unfair, but they were efficient, and ancient life favored efficiency over fairness. In sacred spaces, hair discipline intensified. Priests enforced purity standards strictly. Oils had to be prepared correctly. Cuts had to be symmetrical. Errors were seen as disrespect toward forces unseen. This pressure made ritual specialists meticulous. They feared mistakes more than exhaustion. Pilgrims arriving from distant regions often stood out immediately. Local priests noticed their hair betrayed foreign rites. These pilgrims were guided gently but firmly toward compliance. No malice, just correction. Tradition guarded itself carefully. In family homes, hair grooming was intimate time. Parents set children down slowly. Fingers worked methodically. These moments were quiet. Teaching happened without lectures. Children absorbed patience. This was education beyond words. As children matured, grooming became solitary. This shift marked independence. No ceremony was needed. The change was felt internally. Hair care mirrored selfhood. Among warriors, hair routines reflected readiness. Before conflict, styles tightened. After conflict, loosened. These shifts helped regulate emotion. Hair anchored the mind to ritual when fear threatened focus. In times of peace, warriors allowed indulgence. Decoration crept back. This indulgence was criticized by elders, but tolerated. Peace required release. As empires expanded again, administrators imposed grooming codes. These codes aimed at uniformity. Uniformity eased control. People resisted quietly. They complied outwardly but preserved small deviations. These deviations preserved identity beneath authority. In taxation records and censuses, appearance descriptions included hair, not in detail, but enough to categorize. This categorization simplified governance. It reduced individuals to types, but systems preferred simplicity. In judicial settings, hair presentation mattered. Accused persons were sometimes required to appear groomed or deliberately ungroomed. The choice shaped perception. Judges claimed objectivity, but appearance influenced outcomes. Hair participated in justice silently. Among healers, hair samples were collected, examined, stored. They believed illness revealed itself through strands. Whether true or not, patients believed, and belief itself aided recovery. As oral traditions evolved, songs referenced hair constantly. Metaphors compared time to growth, aging to whitening, grief to cutting. These metaphors resonated universally. Listeners understood instinctively. In coastal rituals, hair offerings were cast into water. This act symbolized release. The sea accepted everything, no return expected. This finality comforted mourners. In desert cultures, covering hair became survival, but survival transformed into morality. Exposed hair was criticized. Covering became virtue. This moralization persisted long after necessity faded. In colder regions, hair insulation mattered. Length equaled warmth. Practicality shaped aesthetics. Long hair was not vanity, it was protection, and protection was valued. As trade introduced new materials, adornment expanded. Beads, metals, textiles. These additions increased weight. Hair bore it silently. People endured discomfort for symbolism. This endurance reinforced commitment. Among elites, excess ornamentation sometimes became ridiculous. Heads tilted from weight, necks strained, but prestige demanded display. Ridicule remained private. Power shielded absurdity. In storytelling circles, Satirical tales mocked excess. These stories entertained commoners. They softened resentment. Laughter served as pressure release. In agricultural rhythms, hair growth aligned with seasons. People noticed patterns. Harvest coincided with cutting. This coincidence was ritualized. Tradition emerged from observation. As famine struck occasionally, hair care declined. Not out of choice, but exhaustion, survival, overshadowed symbolism. Yet once stability returned, rituals resumed quickly. This resilience preserved culture. In borderlands, hybridity flourished. People blended styles unconsciously. Children grew up not knowing origin, they simply wore what worked. These blended forms challenged rigid categories. Authorities attempted to standardize, but hybridity persisted quietly. People valued functionality over doctrine when left alone. In training schools for scribes or officials, grooming standards reinforced discipline, hair routines, structured days. This structure shaped mindset. Order outside cultivated order inside. Among artists, hair defied norms subtly. They experimented quietly. Small deviations signaled creativity. These signals attracted like minded individuals. Communities formed around shared difference. In burial customs, hair preservation varied. Some cultures buried intact, some cut first. These choices reflected beliefs about afterlife, continuity, or release, both comforting in different ways. As legends accumulated, hair heroes emerged. Strength linked to uncut locks, wisdom to white hair. These archetypes influenced behavior. People imitated myths unconsciously. In legal oaths, hair sometimes played a role. Strands held, hands placed upon heads. These gestures bound promises physically. Symbolism anchored commitment. As isolation periods occurred due to disease, grooming rituals changed. People shaved collectively or grew collectively. These shared acts fostered unity. Isolation threatened cohesion. Hair rituals restored it. In households with servants, hierarchy manifested daily through grooming. Who groomed, whom signaled, drank. This hierarchy was accepted, internalized. Power rarely needed enforcement. Among nomadic groups, portability shaped style, simple, flexible, easily maintained. These qualities were praised. Sedentary peoples viewed them as crude. Misunderstanding persisted. In diplomatic encounters, hair differences fascinated envoys. They described them meticulously in reports. These descriptions shaped foreign perception long after meetings ended. Hair traveled through words. As time continued, nothing reset. There was no return to origin, only accumulation. Practices layered upon practices, some forgotten, some remembered. Hair carried traces of all. People aged, hair thinned, grayed. These changes altered status. Elders gained authority. Physical decline translated into social elevation. This inversion comforted aging bodies. In storytelling by fires, elders ran fingers through thinning hair absent-mindedly. Children watched. They associated age with calm. Hair taught lessons without speech. When elders died, their hair routines ended abruptly. This absence was felt. Family members noticed the gap. Mourning included, adjusting to missing rituals. In communal baths, hair care was public. This visibility normalized bodies. Differences became familiar. Familiarity reduced fear. As spiritual philosophies evolved, some emphasized detachment. Hair neglect became virtue. This rejection challenged earlier emphasis on care, but cycles balanced. Neither extreme dominated permanently. Throughout all this movement forward, no one paused to declare an era ended. Life did not segment itself neatly, it flowed, and hair flowed with it, growing, cut, binding, unbinding, marking time invisibly. The ancient world did not hurry toward conclusion. It simply continued. People woke. They touched their heads. They adjusted what had grown. They stepped back into routines shaped long before their birth. And tomorrow would do the same, not looping, not repeating exactly, but advancing quietly, strand by strand, into whatever waited next, carried forward on the heads of those who lived it without ever naming it. The movement forward remained steady, almost unnoticeable, like the slow lengthening of hair itself. People did not mark time with grand reflections, they marked it with routine, a child's first binding, an elder's final cutting. These moments replaced calendars, they anchored memory in the body. As settlements aged further, memory stretched thinner. People remembered what to do, but not why. This forgetting did not weaken tradition, it strengthened it. Actions repeated without debate last longer than ideas argued endlessly. Hair customs survived precisely because they were unexamined. In river societies, water influenced grooming profoundly. Mud cleansed, oils floated away. People adapted, products thickened, methods changed. Hair smelled of river life. This scent became comforting. It meant home. In dry seasons, scarcity reshaped ritual. Oils rationed, cuts simplified, elaboration paused. No one complained. They understood necessity. Tradition bent, but did not break. Among craftsmen, hair signaled trade. Certain styles protected eyes, others ears. These practical choices hardened into guild identity. Children apprenticed adopted the look. They wore profession before mastering it. Hair trained. Expectation. In hunting cultures, hair discipline began early. Children learned restraint, movement control. Hair tied back prevented distraction. This discipline shaped behavior beyond hunting. Focus became virtue. As belief systems overlapped, contradictions emerged. Some taught hair sanctity, others indifference. People navigated these tensions pragmatically. They followed dominant custom publicly. Private practices varied. This duality preserved peace. In households with mixed belief, compromise appeared. Shared meals, shared grooming days. Children learned flexibility early. This adaptability became survival skill. As borders shifted again, conquered peoples retained hair customs quietly. They complied with laws where visible, but within homes, tradition persisted. This private continuity sustained identity under pressure. In royal courts, hair became political again. Heirs styled carefully, favored by mentors, claimed legitimacy visually. Rival factions criticized styles subtly. Appearance arguments replaced direct conflict. Hair became battlefield. Without blood, among messengers, hair signaled neutrality. Simple styles ensured safe passage. Too ornate invited suspicion. Too foreign invited hostility. Balance mattered. Life depended on it. In monasteries again, novices marked progression through hair changes. These changes replaced promotions. They simplified hierarchy. Progress was visible daily. In female-only spaces, hair knowledge deepened, techniques refined, shared without written record. This oral transmission preserved complexity lost elsewhere. Women became keepers of detail. In male-only gatherings, grooming discussions were sparse, but observation was constant. Peers monitored conformity silently. Deviation noticed instantly. Correction followed indirectly. Mockery, silence, exclusion, hair enforced. Cohesion. As metallurgy advanced slowly, tools improved, shears sharpened, cleaner cuts emerged. These improvements subtly altered aesthetics. People adjusted expectations. Hair became neater, not because of desire, but possibility. In religious festivals, collective grooming preceded celebration. This preparation unified participants. Shared effort heightened belonging. Hair was entry requirement for joy. In agricultural rites, offerings included hair mixed with grain. This fusion symbolized unity of body and earth. People trusted land more when part of themselves returned to it. In maritime cultures, salt stiffened hair led to protective coatings. These coatings became signature smell. This smell identified sailors instantly. They carried sea with them inland. As storytelling evolved, metaphors shifted. Hair represented continuity more than strength now. White hair symbolized survival over power. This shift reflected aging societies. People valued endurance. In times of plague, hair fear increased. Some blamed it as carrier. Shaving spread. Sudden uniformity appeared. This emergency response altered aesthetics temporarily. When danger passed, regrowth felt hopeful, visible recovery. Children born during such periods grew up associating hair growth with relief. These associations shaped generational emotion. Hair carried memory beyond words. In legal punishments, hair cutting persisted, but severity varied. Some cuts humiliated, some cleansed. Authorities manipulated symbolism to control narrative. Punishment communicated message visually. Among traders, bribery included grooming gifts, combs, oils. These gifts acknowledged importance of appearance, respect expressed materially. In isolated valleys, unique styles emerged, unnoticed by outsiders. These micro-traditions persisted longest. They faced least interference. Remoteness preserved originality. As roads expanded, isolation decreased. These unique styles encountered others. Some merged, some vanished. This loss was unnoticed locally. People assumed continuity, unaware of dilution. In teaching lineages, masters required apprentices to maintain specific styles. These styles symbolized loyalty. Apprenticeship was visible commitment. Hair betrayed betrayal instantly. In oral law systems, testimony credibility linked to appearance. Groomed witnesses trusted more. This bias shaped outcomes, unfair but accepted. As societies matured, fatigue with excess appeared. Simplicity praised, elaborate styles mocked quietly. This aesthetic shift reflected moral recalibration. After periods of display came restraint. In burial art, carved figures reflected contemporary hair ideals. These carvings froze fashion permanently. Future generations misinterpreted them as eternal norms. This misunderstanding influenced revival attempts later. In ceremonies of reconciliation, hair washing featured prominently. Cleansing signified forgiveness. People believed clean hair allowed clean intentions. This ritual eased conflict resolution. As political power decentralized, local leaders gained autonomy. They reinstated traditional styles suppressed earlier. This restoration felt triumphant. Hair celebrated regained control. In contrast, some communities retained imposed styles even after authority faded. Habituation replaced resistance. People no longer remembered origin of constraint. This forgetting ensured permanence. In remote spiritual practices, hair neglect deepened. Matted forms grew extreme. These forms intimidated outsiders. They protected isolation. Hair became barrier. Among storytellers, hair descriptions softened harsh narratives. They focused on texture rather than violence. This gentleness suited oral transmission. Children listened without fear. In trade guilds again, retirement marked by hair change. Elders altered style voluntarily. This visible shift eased succession. Younger members stepped forward without conflict. As aging increased, hair care burden shifted to community. Neighbors assisted. This assistance strengthened bonds. Dependency normalized. Interdependence preserved cohesion. In famine memory songs, hair loss featured prominently. These songs warned future generations, memory encoded in bodily reference. As exploration pushed outward, explorers adapted hair for travel. Practical changes adopted. These changes later influenced home cultures. Hair carried experience back. In sacred law revisions, hair clauses adjusted subtly. Officials framed changes as clarifications, not alterations. This language preserved authority. People accepted modification without protest. In seasonal migrations, hair practices shifted temporarily. Travel styles differed from home styles. This duality created layered identity. People belonged to multiple rhythms. As time continued, no final synthesis occurred. Cultures did not converge fully. They overlapped, layered. Hair reflected this layering. Strands from different origins intertwined. People lived entire lives within these patterns. They never stepped outside to observe. They simply acted. And through these actions, history advanced quietly. Each generation inherited not a fixed code, but a living one, ordered slightly by necessity, by chance, by forgetting, yet recognizable enough to feel ancient. The ancient world thus moved forward, carried not by declarations or endings, but by daily gestures, repeated with minor variation. Hands lifting, hair tying, cutting, binding, cleaning, adorning. These gestures accumulated into centuries. Nothing looped back exactly. Nothing paused for reflection. Life advanced forward, strand after strand, each person adding a small, unremarked contribution to a tradition they would never see completed, hair continuing to grow as long as people did, carrying meaning quietly onward into whatever future followed next. The flow does not stop. It only thins and stretches as centuries wear on, and the people living inside them rarely notice the passage except in the mirror of their own bodies. Hair keeps record when memory fails. It lengthens when seasons are kind and weakens when life grows heavy. It responds honestly without ceremony. As communities age into quiet maturity, rituals lose sharp edges. They soften. Practices remain, but enforcement relaxes. No one watches as closely. This leniency is not decay, it is confidence. A culture secure in itself does not fear small deviation. Elders sit longer now, they move slower. Younger hands take over grooming more often. These shared moments create continuity not through instruction, but imitation. Children learn by doing, by repeating motions passed down through touch rather than speech. In settlements that have survived long without upheaval, hairstyles settle into near invisibility. They are so normal they stop being noticed. This invisibility is the highest form of tradition. It no longer needs defense. Yet even here, change slips in quietly. A new knot, a different oil, a tool shaped slightly differently. These changes are not announced. They simply work better, and so they stay. Among those who travel between regions, hair becomes adaptable. They learn when to blend and when to stand apart. This skill is subtle. It is taught through mistakes. Once learned, it saves lives and reputations alike. In border towns, children grow up fluent in multiple styles. They shift instinctively. This flexibility becomes identity. They belong everywhere and nowhere equally. Hair reflects this fluidity. In spiritual circles, debates over purity fade. Practice outweighs doctrine. Devotion is measured in consistency rather than appearance. This shift reduces conflict. People focus inward more than outward. As belief in omens wanes slightly, practical interpretations grow. Strands are read less for prophecy and more for health. This transition feels natural. No one marks it as philosophical change. In healing houses, hair samples are no longer revered. They're examined pragmatically. This quiet shift marks maturation of knowledge without erasing tradition entirely. In aristocratic houses, extravagance exhausts itself. Younger generations reject excess not out of rebellion, but fatigue. They prefer comfort. Hairstyles simplify. This simplicity becomes new status marker. Old portraits remain on walls, showing former extremes. These images amuse rather than instruct. People see them as artifacts of another mood, not another world. Among farmers, hair routines align fully with labor. They are stripped of symbolism beyond function. This practicality anchors society. Food matters more than display. In festivals, however, decoration returns briefly. This contrast heightens joy. People enjoy temporary excess precisely because it is temporary. Hair becomes celebration rather than statement. As language evolves slowly, metaphors tied to hair persist even as meanings blur. Expressions remain, though original context fades. This linguistic persistence preserves memory unconsciously. In lullabies, references to hair calm children. These songs connect generations emotionally. Hair becomes comfort symbol. Everyone understands without explanation. In legal customs, appearance loses some weight. Testimony matters slightly more. This shift reflects growing trust in process over perception. Hair steps back from judgment slowly. In isolated spiritual orders, extreme practices continue unchanged. These groups exist parallel to mainstream. They neither influence nor threaten. They simply persist. Hair marks their separation clearly. As trade networks stabilize, fashion cycles slow. People stop chasing novelty. They value durability. Hairstyles last longer before shifting. This stability calms society. In education spaces, grooming rules relax slightly. Students experiment within bounds. This experimentation produces innovation quietly. New norms form gradually. In families, stories about ancestors increasingly focus on character rather than appearance. Hair details fade. This indicates shift toward internal values, but grooming rituals remain unchanged. Habit outlives explanation. In old age, many forget reasons behind practices, but they remember feelings, care, belonging, structure. Hair routines provide these feelings reliably. As death approaches for individuals, hair care becomes gentler, less demanding. The body dictates limits. Family adjusts expectations without resentment. This compassion reflects societal maturity. In final rites, hair receives simple attention, no excess, no neglect. Balance reflects acceptance of a life fully lived. As generations overlap, children grow up observing elders at ease with simplicity. This calm shapes aspiration. People come to value steadiness over display. In marketplaces, difference attracts fewer glances. Variety becomes familiar. After enough exposure, people grow comfortably unbothered. This ease creates quiet peace. In storytelling gatherings, narratives now reach further back. They favor continuity over singular triumph. Hair appears only as background detail, not as emblem. This quiet shift signals its return to ordinary life. In distant regions, untouched by broader transitions, older customs remain. These places are not behind. They exist along a different current of time. As contact across distances grows, these regions open gradually. They exchange ideas without surrendering their character. Change is chosen, not imposed. In shared calendars, Some grooming rituals fade without ceremony. There is no resistance. Simpler practices take their place, meaning moves rather than disappears. In music and poetry, rhythm echoes daily care. Slow, repetitive, calming, the pattern itself becomes the comfort. Hair is felt as tempo, not image. As people age into understanding, words grow fewer, actions deepen, care becomes reflective instead of expressive. Attention turns inward as cycles complete. In communal memory, hair ceases to be debated. It simply exists. It does its work silently, holding history without comment. Time continues forward without punctuation. No era ends with declaration. Practices fade or persist based on usefulness and comfort. The ancient world thus carries itself onward, not driven by ambition or fear, but by habit refined through centuries of living. Hands still rise each morning, heads still bow for washing or binding, scissors still close gently around strands grown overnight. People do not think of these acts as history, they are just life. And yet, through these unremarkable gestures, entire civilizations move forward. Nothing circles back to begin again. There is no loop, no return to origin, only accumulation. Every day adds a layer too thin to notice alone, but vast when viewed across generations. Hair continues to grow, to change, to fall away, marking the passage of bodies through time more faithfully than any monument. The people carrying it age, replace one another, and disappear, but the customs they practiced endure in softened form, passed along without ceremony. And so the story does not end with a conclusion or a lesson. It simply continues forward, steady, and unbroken, carried quietly by ordinary lives, each one adding a small, unnoticed strand to the long, unending weave of the ancient world.